At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, a nuclear reactor exploded in Soviet Ukraine. The blast was so powerful it released hundreds of times more radioactive material than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Within hours, tens of thousands of people were fleeing their homes. Within days, an entire city was erased from existence. But here's the part nobody talks about. The Soviet government waited about 36 hours to evacuate anyone. They didn't tell the world what happened. They told their own people nothing. And the worst part, it could have been prevented. One button, one safety system left on instead of turned off. That's the difference between a contained reactor and an uncontrolled chain reaction that still poisons the Earth decades later. I'm not going to tell you Chernobyl was Russia's fault. It was the Soviet Union, which is a different geopolitical monster. I'm also not going to pretend we have perfect data on death tolls, because the USSR lied about everything, and we're still figuring out what happened. What I can tell you is this: survivor testimony, radiation mapping that's still ongoing, and enough evidence to understand exactly how a system failed at every single level. It's April 1986. The Soviet Union is a superpower, but it's cracking. The economy is struggling, the arms race is bleeding resources, and the Communist Party is desperate to show the world that Soviet technology is superior. So they build Chernobyl, a massive nuclear power plant that will prove Soviet engineering excellence. It becomes one of the most powerful reactors on Earth. But here's what gets lost in the propaganda. The reactor has a design flaw. The RBMK-1000 has what's called a positive void coefficient. That's nuclear speak for when parts of the cooling water turns to steam, the reactor gets more reactive and more dangerous instead of calming down. Every sane reactor design in the world is built the opposite way. If something goes wrong and it starts to overheat, the physics push it towards shutting itself down. Not this one. This one wanted to burn hotter when something went wrong. Nobody at the top of the Soviet hierarchy wants to admit this. Admitting a flaw means admitting weakness, so they hide it. They don't tell other countries. They don't tell the operators at the plant. They just let it run. Then, on April 26th, someone decides to run a safety test. The idea sounds good. What happens to the reactor if we lose power? Can the backup systems handle it? It's a legitimate question. But to run the test, the operators have to disable multiple safety systems. They have to turn off the automatic shutdown. They have to ignore warning lights. They have to override everything that's supposed to stop a disaster. And that's when the anomaly hits. The reactor starts heating up faster than anyone expected. The positive void coefficient is kicking in. The reactor is getting hotter instead of cooler. Warning lights are flashing. Sirens are screaming. And the operators, panicking, trained to trust the system, believing nothing really bad could happen, keep the safety systems disabled. Let's start with the design. The RBMK reactor was powerful and could produce electricity cheaply, which is why the Soviet Union loved it. But it had one catastrophic weakness. When water in the cooling system turns to steam, the reactor doesn't cool down, it heats up. More steam equals more heat equals faster chain reaction. It's a positive feedback loop. Eventually, it explodes. Every other reactor design in the world has a negative feedback loop. If it gets too hot, it automatically shuts down. The Soviets knew about this. The Americans knew about this. Everyone knew this design was dangerous. But admitting it meant the Soviet Union had made a strategic mistake. And admitting mistakes wasn't how the system worked. So the reactor kept running. And the operators at Chernobyl, they weren't idiots. They were trained engineers doing exactly what they were told. But they were told to disable safety systems for a test that was badly planned, poorly supervised, and driven by bureaucrats in Moscow who had no idea what they were asking for. The test begins. The reactor starts to heat up. For the first few minutes, everything seems normal. Then the power surges, the temperature climbs, warning lights come on. The operators hit the emergency button to insert the control rods, metal rods that slow the chain reaction. But here's the catch. The control rods were designed badly too. When they started to go in, they briefly increased the reactivity before they decreased it, so the reactor got even hotter right when the emergency systems tried to cool it down. At that moment, someone made a choice. They could have continued the emergency shutdown and evacuated, or they could abandon the test. What they actually did was press one button, and that button activated the final failsafe, the one that would have prevented the explosion if the Soviet Union had installed it correctly. They didn't. The reactor exploded at 1:23 a.m. The blast was so powerful, it blew the 1,000-ton lid off the reactor core. The graphite moderator, the material that controls the chain reaction, caught fire. That fire burned for weeks, sending radioactive smoke into the atmosphere. The equivalent of 400 Hiroshima bombs worth of radiation, 7 times more radiation than Hiroshima released in a single bombing. But the explosion was just the beginning. The Soviet government's response was the real disaster. They waited 36 hours to evacuate Pripyat, the city built right next to the reactor. 50,000 people lived there. 50,000 people breathed radioactive air for a day and a half while the government tried to figure out what to say. When they finally evacuated, people were given minutes to leave. 30 minutes. Grab what you can and get on buses. They were told they'd be back in 3 days. They never went back. Pripyat became a ghost city. And the cover-up? The Soviet Union told the world nothing. Sweden detected the radiation and called Moscow asking what happened. Moscow said it was a minor accident. They lied. They lied about radiation levels. They lied about the death toll. They lied about the cause. For weeks, the world only knew something had gone catastrophically wrong because Swedish radiation monitors were screaming. The death toll is still disputed. The official Soviet number was 31 immediate deaths, but modern estimates suggest thousands died in the first few months from acute radiation poisoning. Over the long term, cancer rates skyrocketed. International health organizations estimate 4,000 excess deaths. Environmental groups estimate closer to 200,000. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but we'll never know because the Soviets destroyed records. What we do know is this: 500,000 workers, called liquidators, were sent into the radioactive zone to contain the damage. Many of them didn't know what radiation actually was. They were just told to work until the job was done. Some of them died immediately. Others got sick years later. A government sent its own people into a contamination zone without proper protection because admitting the truth was more dangerous to them than exposing workers to lethal radiation. I know this is a lot to process. Your brain is putting together the pieces: a design flaw, disabled safety systems, a government that chose secrecy over human life. And the result was a catastrophe that's still poisoning the Earth 4 decades later. That anger is justified. But here's what fascinates me. Humanity learned from Chernobyl. Not fast enough, not enthusiastically, but we learned. Nuclear reactor design changed. Safety protocols tightened. Countries started being more transparent about radiation incidents. The disaster became a turning point. In Pripyat, that ghost city became something else. It became a memorial, a physical reminder of what happens when you hide the truth, when you cut corners, when you care more about looking good than being safe. For 40 years, nature has been reclaiming it. Trees grow through buildings, animals have returned. It's not healed, but it's being remembered. The real question about Chernobyl isn't, how did a reactor explode? The real question is, what does it mean that a government chose to let its own people be poisoned rather than admit it made a mistake? Because that's what happened. Every hour they waited to evacuate, more radiation entered people's lungs. Every lie they told delayed medical response. Every record they destroyed made it impossible to help victims because we couldn't even count them. Chernobyl wasn't a technical disaster, it was a moral one. The reactor failed, the safety systems failed, but what really broke was the system that valued power and image over human life. And that lesson isn't confined to the Soviet Union. Every nuclear plant on Earth is run by governments and corporations. Every one of them faces pressure to cut corners, hide problems, and prioritize profit. Chernobyl showed us what happens when that pressure wins. We started asking, what happened to Chernobyl and how did a safety test become a catastrophe? We looked at design flaws, operator error, Soviet cover-ups, and the human cost of a government's choice to hide the truth. What we found was a disaster that was almost entirely preventable and entirely forgivable until the moment someone decided lying was better than coming clean. Here's what I want to know. Do you think we've actually fixed the problems Chernobyl exposed, or are we just hoping the next disaster doesn't happen? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely interested whether you trust modern nuclear safety or if Chernobyl made you skeptical for life. If stories about system failure and government cover-ups fascinate you, subscribe and stick around for more.